Right. Okay. I think we're going to start off. Thank you very much for joining. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar and the discussion series about tipping elements, irreversibility, and abrupt changes in the Earth system. My name is Rebermark, and I am from the Earth Commission for Future Earth, and I'll be moderating today the fantastic speakers and lineup that we've got for you. For those of you who are new to these sessions, we know that there's a lot of communicators who had registered for this event, so that's fantastic to see. But this is a series, the community behind this series is a range of world-leading research networks and initiatives who've been convening Earth system and social scientists to explore and advance knowledge on the complexity of natural systems and also interactions with human activities. So our huge thanks to all of the partners behind the series that you can see on the screen here. And the goal of this overarching discussion series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements, and specifically with supporting sort of increased consistency within the scientific community, but also to engage with stakeholders outside of academia. So the formula for today's discussion will be a bit different to those who have proceeded in the series to date. We're going to have a quick fire 5-minute introductions from all of the different speakers, and then we'll have a kind of an in-depth discussion around 40 minutes, which we hope, please everybody put your questions in the chat box, and we'll bring those into the discussions towards the end of the session. So we'll be tackling communications and hearing from a wide range of creatives and scientists who in various different ways have been engaged with tipping point science or are using approaches that tipping point science communications could really benefit from. House rules before we kick off. You should be able to see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So please feel free to post questions throughout the sessions and the talks. And if you have a specific question for an individual, please indicate who that question is for. And everyone should be able to upvote questions that are in the chat box. So we're going to take a pretty, for me, certainly an infinitely interesting, but also really challenging topic of communicating complex science, specifically tipping point science, that are extremely harmful, tipping points that are in the natural world that could pose huge risks to society. And their triggering could damage both the planet's life support systems, but also the stability of our societies that rely on all of the different inputs that we get from these natural systems. So a main question for today is what kind of experience and guidance and insights from various different communicators outside of academia bring to the table, and on this journey to share complex science for societal decision-making and for public comprehension. So I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one. First up, really happy to introduce, we have an additional guest that we are welcoming today, Caroline Zimm, who many of you may recognize. She's a research scholar at IIASA, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, and she's also connected to a number of programs connected to energy and climate, environment, equity and justice. She currently works with the Earth Commission, the Global Commons Alliance Scientific Cornerstone, and also leads strategic initiatives on just transitions to net zero. And Caro, I really want to say, has been the engine behind these seminars over the last almost 2 years. So it's wonderful to welcome her to the front stage. And Caro, please give us a bit of an overview about some of the, recurring communication questions that have sort of come up in the discussions in this tipping point series, and also some of your personal experiences with media. Thank you, Caro. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Maya, for inviting me to join this esteemed and diverse group of experts. First, I want to share the two different kinds of experiences I have. One is from the perspective of organizing this discussion series and exchanging knowledge across different research fields on tipping points. And the second one is from my personal insights from working with the media and the general audiences on tipping points. So first, from the discussion series, we really aim here at facilitating communication across disciplines. So we're still within science, but also we want to act as a vehicle to communicate cutting edge research in the field of tipping points to different interested audiences. Yeah. And in this sense, we hope to stimulate discussion, identify research gaps, but also be a learning and knowledge, a go-to knowledge resource to our videos that we then put online. So far, we have convened 24 events with around 90 experts from fields as diverse as permafrost modeling or historians working on ancient civilizations. 1/3 of the events so far have covered human or social tipping points, and 2/3 have covered Earth and climate system tipping points. And including today, we have reached around 4,000 people joining the events on live, but many, many more through accessing the recordings that we will provide online. And I also invite you all to take a look at those recordings because they're really a great resource on different tipping elements. And what I've noticed so far in those in the past 2 years can be roughly grouped into 4 observations. One is, okay, and this is maybe the most logical, is there is great research within the community, great interest within the communities to engage and talk about tipping points with each other, both within individual communities, but also experts wanting to engage with experts working on tipping points in a bit of different fields and share their research. We also have great interest from the general public, including civil society organizations, media, and policymakers. And 2, what this shows is that tipping points, the concept is attractive, it gets attention. And I would be curious to hear from the other aspect how we can then leverage this into action across different levels. And I'll get to this later in more detail. 3, for communicating within and across different research communities, we need an agreement on terminology. And in some fields, concepts like tipping points have a longer track record, they're more established. And in other fields, we use different terminology and wordings, such as critical transitions or regime shift. And this can lead to confusion. It is also time consuming to talk about definitions. It's not so interesting when you engage with the broader public, but it is critical for within research discussions. But then also it's distract sometimes from the content and from the impact of potential tipping. If you discuss for a very long, is this now a tipping point or not, and which definitions are you using or not? But one also has to acknowledge that science is evolving, and as such, also terminology is evolving and advancing. And 4, researchers have a range of analogies, visuals, and animations at hand to communicate and make this abstract concept of tipping points accessible. And this is very useful. And again, I invite you to look at our recordings because there you will see prime examples of such animations. But also, I'm sure that today we will see some of these examples. And next, going to my personal experience from communicating insights from our research, both from the Global Tipping Points report and also the Earth Commission work, communicating to media and different audiences, like from local policymakers to schools, high school students, university students, or local NGOs. I reiterate again, there is great interest in climate and Earth system tipping points. But 2, then when you go to a focused discussion, especially with journalists, there's a wish for very concrete and localized statements. Journalists want to know exactly in which year does the tipping occur? What will this translate exactly to my city, in my country? And this is what they need for reporting. And this is at odds with a lot of the scientific statements and the way we share information. So I hope that we can discuss about this as well. 3, when it comes to reactions to climate and Earth system tipping points, questions that arise are often, are we all doomed? Does anything still matter? And the tipping points sometimes seem to give the impression that it's too big of a task to handle, leading to like inaction, instead of the accelerated action that we actually have in mind with this. And even without tipping points, any climate impact leads to great suffering, and we should do everything to mitigate climate change. So here I hope we can discuss how we can move forward towards enabling action. And 4, similarly to the climate and Earth system tipping points, there's also great interest in tipping in socio-economic systems, as this gives hope for accelerated change. So this is like the positive story. And here also the general public and journalists ask for very precise statements or predictions, which we often cannot give, or should not give even. And this is also a field that I think we have to think about more when we communicate with the general public. Yeah, I look forward to the other panelists' reflections, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Caro. A lot to consider, and certainly one of the points I would love, Colin, if you could also think about in your response next, is this, in terms of visualizations, you know, there's a space in a world for science visualizations, and there's another space for broad communications visualizations, and how do we bridge those gaps, or not even gaps? How do we make sure that, you know, the right visuals, get in front of the right audiences. But I'd like to introduce now Colin Butfield to everybody. Colin is the former executive director from WWF. He's also the founder of Silverback Studios, who are studios who work on the groundbreaking Our Planet series. We've worked with Silverback on a WEF film that we produced for Communicating Tipping Points sometime, a year and a half ago, I think it was now.
Yeah.
I'm going to pop it in the chat, so if anybody wants to have a look, please do. It's the first 5 minutes of a 12-minute presentation, and the team were fantastic working with us on translating that. But also, Colin, you've been working in various different ways with the concept of tipping points and planetary science for a long time. So please share some of your experiences related to how can you bring this to life in a way for broad people. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that intro. And it's great to see so many people have joined today that we've worked with, and so many incredible panelists. So I can already see this, the team from Exeter University. We've had the pleasure of working with Tim and the team on positive tipping points, so the scale of change and how that can work. We've also done a film with Johanna and the PIC team on Netflix called Breaking Boundaries, looking at planetary boundaries, obviously, but also how negative tipping points can be involved. So we've been doing this for quite a long time, and I think it's worth almost taking a step back and realizing the scale of what we have to communicate here. You're talking about whether it's the impact of the negative tipping points, the planet Earth system science elements of this, or you're talking about the scale of societal change that could be unleashed with some of the positive tipping points that Tim Lenton and others have been working on. You're talking about one of the biggest, if not the biggest, shifts in society that has ever been seen against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world. And I think it's worth thinking that that cannot be achieved by individual action alone. It cannot be achieved by businesses alone. It cannot be achieved by science alone, or politics alone, or multilateral events alone. You're talking about changing on every single level of that. And that means changing literally the next stage of the human story. And if you think about how storytelling comes into our evolution, then ever since the first human civilizations, it has been stories that have helped us make sense of the world. When we didn't understand we were on a planet, what explained the stars in the sky? When we didn't understand the different climatic seasons and the different ways that the Earth was changing during those periods, again, it was storytelling that helped to evolve and understand that. As we reached a more stable climate 12,000 years ago or so, and we had civilizations, it was stories that underpinned what defined and held together those civilizations, whether it was cultures, it was religions, it was politics, it was what we considered to be valuable and how we traded with one another. It's those things are underpinned by a shared human story. And we're looking essentially at creating the next, if not arguably the biggest chapter in the human story. And sometimes it can feel like we're doing it almost with one or both hands tied behind our backs. We're talking about needing to reach people at every level of understanding, from people who are deeply involved in the science and want to immediately almost get to how this plays out in reality, to people that are considering a number of great geopolitical elements of this, to people who have maybe picked up a couple of tweets or a few news stories or a little bit of understanding within education, and trying to reach all of those people in all of those languages against all of those different contexts and competing media environments at the same time, and trying to cut through. And I'd say our experience of being probably one of the only production companies I'm aware of that specializes in focusing on these things is the level of resource and time that goes into communications is often considerably lower than goes into the other, albeit vital, disciplines. So the amount of time and money that goes into science, I would never knock for a second, it should be more. The amount of time and money that goes into field conservation or work on human development or other elements of the SDGs, again, vital, wouldn't question it for a second. But quite often communications or storytelling is the last thing that comes along. It's the thing where you've spent 5 million on a project and you've got £25,000 to communicate it to 1 million people. It's not going to work. We've got to find the way, if we really want this scale of societal change, to really think about how and resource how we communicate this and unleash it to a variety of people across a myriad of different formats. And I think one of the biggest shifts in doing that is to be able to enable anyone in any language in any part of the world to be able to pick up, understand and tell that story, and be able to trust the elements of that story. So, I mean, one of the things we've been recently pioneering with many people who are on this webinar today is how we can open source a lot of materials to do that, whether it's the scientific understanding and explanation of that or the visual imagery that enables you to do it. Because too often those atoms, those aspects are either removed because they require so much understanding or translation, or because they're so expensive to get, or because they're technically difficult to put into a story. And if we're going to truly manage to reach the scale of people we need to reach at the consistency that we need to reach them in the different levels of understanding that everybody has, we need to democratize the ability to tell this story and free it up from either big production companies like ourselves or expert scientists, and find the means of getting it into the hands of everybody at a level that makes sense to them. As a small thing I'll put into the chat now, we've just got a beta version of a platform called Open Planet, which aims to begin to do that. I know there's many others on this call that are also pioneering other initiatives, but I think that open sourcing and making everything translatable to everybody is going to be critical for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. I think there's a lot of people who are in on this webinar who recognize that resourcing challenge. It's certainly something that all of us in the panelists have discussed in various different ways, and I completely agree. It's a massive uphill struggle, and different ways that, you know, democratizing the material, open source, open access, critical going forward. But also the other challenge that I hope we'll get to when we discuss is, or how can we also help make sure that there is more funding and more resource available at the inception point as well to create this stuff. So next, I would love to, I'm going to hand over to Anab, Jain from Superflux, who we've also had the privilege of working with recently on creating some future visualizations of a potential safe and just future, very based on the science of the Earth Commission. And that has been a fantastic creative process. Anab is a designer, a futurist, and an educator, and she's the co-founder of Superflux, who is the speculative design studio that we worked with. And she's also a professor for design investigations at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and with a big focus in Superflux on how can design help orientate us in this complex and very uncertain world. So Anab, please share some of your reflections about using speculative design to create futures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Maya, and thanks to all the panelists for what is going to be a really inspiring discussion. I am true to my work, will share slides because it's a very visual piece of work that we do. So I'm just going to share slides and sort of talk you through my thinking, our studio's thinking. So we often hear when we talk to climate scientists, policymakers, and the academic community that if we communicate back better, action will surely follow. You know, if we just need to communicate better, break out of the bubble and into the world. And when we do that, there will be action. But our question increasingly that we find is how can we better communicate something so vast, abstract, and multiple as climate altered futures? What does that look and feel like? Embodying futures is the work we do at Superflux. We are on a mission to leave a meaningful legacy for our planet and its future custodians. So I think importantly to mention is that our work often intersects with science, industry, and policy, but it is also often something that comes after science, passes the baton on to quote-unquote art. And this is what Colin was talking about, that we get to communicate after the science is done. But we want to question this separation or this hierarchy. Science helps us rationalize the problem. And I believe that art, everything from stories to experiences and immersive experiences, can truly move us and help us touch that possibility. And we feel that once people truly feel what is at stake, once they feel and touch it, they are more inclined to act on it because it becomes part of your muscle memory. In terms of the actual work we do, because it's slightly unknown, is that we create artifacts from the future, stories of possible futures, and environments of possible futures. Things that you can directly touch, you can interact with, and you can sort of form human relationships with. And these kind of rich experiences can transport people into a future they haven't imagined before. What does a safe and just future actually look like and feel like? What people find easy to do is they can imagine what the problems are today, but they find it really hard to imagine what a positive future could look and feel like. We've done things like building large-scale immersive installations for COP, or talking about how to step into an altered world at the Action Speaks Summit at New York Climate Week, to sort of crafting artifacts around what if our rivers, what if AI spoke for our rivers? What if we gave voice to our rivers and advocate for ecological flourishing? So this is just, I want to quickly give you an example of this kind of work. But I think let me dive into something more specific. So for instance, one example is this work we did for the Ministry of Energy at the government of UAE. They had all these scenarios, you know, if we invest so much, we could have so much in renewable energy, this is what the world could look like. But they were not able to get the Prime Minister and the ministers of the cabinet to really invest in renewable energy. Scenarios and data felt abstract and difficult to relate to. So alongside the scenarios and data, we took with us samples of polluted air from the future if we stayed as usual, if it was business as usual. Getting the Prime Minister to inhale a breath of the toxic polluted air from the future was hugely powerful in getting them to understand what that data actually would feel like. What is the air your children and grandchildren will breathe? And that led, alongside the policy recommendations, to a huge investment in renewable energy, as opposed to what was earlier planned. So really, what is the key to the future that we want to protect? And we feel it's pre-experiencing the future will help us more emotionally attached to it. A graph that we repeatedly show people and ask them to see themselves in it is something like this from NASA. People cannot see themselves in this graph. They cannot imagine what it means for them in their homes, in their daily lives. And so we asked a question around this graph. What food would we eat in a future where we have extreme weather events, economic uncertainty? We started building food computers from scratch and created an apartment set in the future in a climate-altered world. People were invited to enter this apartment, spend time in it. They start to realize, and this is one possibility. It's not a prediction, it's not a render, but a chance to directly step into a possible future. They heard a radio talking about a different world. They saw newspapers talking about a different future.
Billions of dollars of damage. And the widespread.
They even saw books. There were provocations like pets as protein. We were not suggesting you eat your pets, but to start to explore what a transformed world could look like. Turning round the corner, they realized a majority of the apartment was given up to food production and consuming and growing. And this were all fully working food computers and signs of the very happy and thriving family. It's not to say that we should all give up our apartment homes and start growing full food computers and put them and start growing food in them, but it is to say, what if we did this? What does that feel like? Are we able to think about this and make better decisions today? And that's the question we really ask. We believe that people must see themselves as actors in the future. And to do that, the abstract future must be made tangible and proximate. Only when they feel the future will they actually want to enact it. So then my point here is, rather than science passing the baton to art and art passing the baton to daily life, is there the capacity for these domains to coalesce seamlessly? Can we create work that speaks to the lived experiences that bind us together as a global community? I believe is fundamental if we are to move towards more hopeful futures. Thank you.
Anab, thank you so much. Just popping my video back on here. Fantastic overview and really incredibly exciting projects that you've been working on. And I know there's many more coming up. I think that's a wonderful segue over to our colleague, Johanna Hoffmann, as well, who who works in a similar area, but very different also to you, Anab. Just bringing up, sorry, changing the pin here to Johanna so that you are on screen for everybody. So Johanna is an urbanist, and she's working in the space between design, planning, fiction, and futures, and specializes in using speculative futures tools to enhance collaborative capacities, both in urban development and policy planning. I would love to invite her to talk about co-cultivating imagination, because I think this was one of the key points that comes out of your work at Anab as well, is about how do we provoke imagination to see a better future than the one that is laid out in sort of, doom headlines, but also arguably people can be confronted with tipping point research. So please, Johanna, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. So unfortunately, my Zoom screen is slightly broken. I was also going to share some slides, but we're just going to roll with it and do our best. I work with speculative futures, which is a version of exactly what Anab Jain just showed you. She is such a forerunner in the field. It's thrilling to be on the same panel. My way of using speculative futures, and I'm the co-founder of a studio called Design for Adaptation. We combine strategic planning and speculative futures tools to survey possible trajectories of future change in order to inform present-day action. As Anab just beautifully articulated, the future is always a way of talking about the present, the choices that we make today. And so in terms of understanding ourselves as present-day actors and where we are moving towards, where our descendants will be moving towards, that's really the way of collapsing the distance between tomorrow and the present moment and the power that it can give us for understanding where we might be headed. So one of the ways in which I and my firm work with speculative futures tools are really about supporting systems thinking, because when we're talking about the challenges that we face today, we are talking about increasingly complex systems that we are part of. I'm trained as a landscape architect and urban planner, so I focus a lot on cities, on the urban environments that many of us live in. And when we're thinking about the challenges that many of them face today, I think understanding the ways in which operations at one global scale influence very local, site-specific, day-to-day personal realities is essential. And it's also quite hard to do. If we're thinking about, trajectories that we're still experiencing from COVID, there was a lot of supply chain breakdowns that limited not just construction sites that couldn't get materials in order to build projects, or hospitals that couldn't get vital equipment. It's also created a lot of spikes in prices of food, energy, all of which is creating geopolitical instability all across the world on longer-term sustained levels. So really understanding the uncertainty that we're facing, not just in the future trajectories that we're moving towards as a result of tipping points, but we're also experiencing them right now. And we're kind of at the limits of our abilities to understand the complexity of the systems that are affecting our life. This is not just something that affects people who are coming from harder scientific disciplines. It very much affects people who are more in the sociological, social studies, urban-related spaces in which I operate. When we're talking about how to show the effects of global capitalist trajectories, projects, financial flows, those are really hard to do. Visualization tactics, whether they're happening at international museum installations like the Venice Biennale, or they're happening at local community meetings, are very, very difficult. When we're talking about how to communicate those things across scales, many people oftentimes use tools like showing documentary footage and connecting different documentaries of projects that are happening on the ground so that people can maybe identify via different web-based systems what those images might look like. That's a wonderful capacity, hugely important. Oftentimes, those projects do not necessarily show the flows of capital investment, how ideas about what preferable spaces are travel from one place to another. Again, some of these images, I would love to show you in person, but just to articulate some of the ways in which people have done amazing research to talk about interventions that are happening right now to adapt to climate change. Kai Go, she's a professor who worked at UCLA. has been tracking how Dutch approaches to adapting to climate change, which oftentimes involve certain large-scale interventions as well as small-scale, have been exported now to different parts of the world, everywhere from New York City to Jakarta. That's a really firm idea about what good interventions in physical space are. But when we move ideas, when we move forms of capital, when we move different kinds of investment from one area of the globe to another, they oftentimes butt up against local site-specific conditions that can oftentimes create really intense forms of inequity, oftentimes a lot of violent conflict. And so when we're talking about how to understand the complexity of the systems in which we live, it's an important way about talking about unintended consequences. Feeling into the future, as Anab just so beautifully articulated, is a way of exploring possible trajectories in order to understand when we're moving an idea, when we're moving forms of investment, when we're trying to collaborate across scales, we need to understand how these different scales are intrinsically connected. The way to do that, I think a powerful way, it's not the only way, but I definitely believe that it's an important factor, is to communicate the personal impacts of these larger scale systemic changes. And I think that's where speculative futures tactics become really powerful and important. Again, as Anab just articulated, it's about making these complex trajectories of change feel personal. What spaces will I be living in? Where will my children be living? What will we be drinking in the morning when we wake up? Is it going to be coffee? Probably not, because coffee is having a pretty difficult time in terms of growing in climatically changed environments. What am I going to drink is a way of reflecting on what does this mean for my daily future life. So a lot of the work that we do at our firm is slightly less high resolution prototypes to work with people on a more iterative and collaborative basis of exploring potential trajectories of change and linking the reflection that can happen by engaging with future spaces in a way of trying to inform decisions that we make right now. So a lot of my work is integrated into urban planning. A lot of it is in strategic planning and working with cities. And what we do is explore different provocations. Since Midjourney and DALL-E have come out, we're using some different AI tools to do just rapid test prototypes. Some of these high resolution installations, videos, experiences, whether they're in VR, in real life, they can take a lot of time and money to create. And so I really want to emphasize that there is a way and a value of creating low resolution prototypes of potential futures, whether those are science fiction stories that we write as individuals or together. There's a lot of stuff that comes with using technological tools in terms of embedded biases, but in order to move forward and explore these futures in high resolution, again, ways, we have to start in a low resolution place. So one of the ways that we work with our collaborators is using things like Midjourney, like DALL-E, to explore provocations, like what happens if we live in a future where buildings are made to biodegrade. We used this prompt the other day in order to explore what creating zero waste systems in cities require and at what scales. And because the speculative future reality connects to a world in which different governance, political, economic, and environmental conditions are at play, we use these exercises as opportunities to connect to people, to systems that have dynamics across scales that might enable such a future to occur. So different diagramming tools become very powerful here. By diagramming how seemingly disparate pieces of research and abstract phenomenon can connect to dynamics of daily life, we can help people link to the ways in which world and regional scales connect to human and local scale experience. So it's thrilling to be part of this conversation. And just to kind of sum up, I think linking the personal, again, to these larger systemic scales of change is the essential piece that can really help to communicate not just where trajectories of change might take us, but also the biases that we are bringing in terms of what preferable trajectories of change are, so that hopefully we can have basis for dialogue and discussion about where we collectively want to head towards.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. There's so much here, and I can't wait until we get into the discussion and you can all start talking to each other. Well, what I want to do now is bring in one of our scientists, David Armstrong McKay. It would be brilliant to hear a bit from you at this point. So David is a climate biosphere scientist, and he's a prolific communicator on tipping points, both from the Earth Commission and also with Exeter. You speak to the press very often. You have a website dedicated to didactically explaining the impacts of tipping points and how people can grasp their heads around the complexity. And you have quite an experience of being thrown into the spotlight on the world stage to explain a lot of this. So David, please, the floor is yours for some insights into what is that like as a scientist, and how do you see communicating tipping points in terms of challenges and opportunities going forward?
Cool, thank you very much, Maya. I'm going to be speaking today about my experiences with science communication from my sort of natural scientist background. Also to note that I'm just coming out of a period of recent illness, so I won't be speaking for too long, and excuse any sniffles I have along the way. So yeah, a bit of my background is that I first started talking about climate tipping points in public, sort of doing communications on it, back in 2016, when I started out with a small outreach grant during one of my earlier postdocs. And as part of that, we developed a nice animation, which is still available on YouTube. We had stalls at local science festivals trying to explain what climate tipping points are. And I also set up this website, climatetippingpoints.info, which we'll share in the chat afterwards for people to look at. And the idea was really to try and explain climate tipping points in relatively simple terms, develop some graphics, simple graphics to try and explain what they are, use simple analogies to explain what climate tipping points are to the public. At this point, climate tipping points were a known thing, but they weren't so publicly well known, discussed in the media, for example. So it was more kind of introducing people to the concept. Then in 2018, there was the big wave of climate activism that started with the Fridays for Future climate strikers after that very hot summer. And then also the rise of Extinction Rebellion that autumn as well. And that really helped to accelerate interest and discussion of things like climate tipping points, feedbacks, things like that. And I noticed a lot more hits coming in on the website at that point. But something I also noticed that after a friend asked me around that time, early 2019 actually, to check some of the claims that were being circulated on the internet, I noticed that climate tipping points were being shared in a way and discussed that actually meant there was a lot of misinformation out there as well. There was a lot of hype and misunderstanding and anxiety around them. So that's when I decided to start doing some more long-form explainers and fact checks on climatetippingpoints.info to try and carefully explain in a bit more detail, but still in relatively simple terms, what we do and what we don't know about climate tipping points, where the limits of our knowledge is, and what that means for climate action. I've had a lot of positive feedback from readers, but also people like activists and fellow scientists about the website. And then also I've heard from a lot of people that it's been used by educators, for example, in courses at universities and at school. And it's also read by people in kind of the policy and business worlds as well to get kind of a picture of what the latest on climate tipping points is. I've also had people come to me who have actually been really highly distressed by some of the presentations of climate tipping points in kind of activists and media discussion. People who have become very kind of fatalistic about the prognosis for humanity based on this, and who have helped, the website has helped sort of come back to a more, not necessarily a positive place, but a place where they understand it better and they can see that it's not kind of this end of the world sort of scenario. Something else I did through the website, but also through another project I'd like to highlight called Researchers Desk, is that I think it's very important to be engaging people in dialogue, members of the public, actually being able to ask us questions and have a two-way dialogue with people like myself, with scientists via social media. And also, I said the Researchers Desk project, we had stalls out during some of these public protests, the Fridays for Future, some of the Friday climate strikes. They had big marches. We would have a stall at the side there under this Researchers Desk banner, where the climate strikers could come up and ask us direct questions and actually have a conversation with climate scientists about their concerns, about their what their questions are to do with climate science. So there's that two-way dialogue. And then more recently, we've published some major scientific reassessments of climate tipping points. Back in 2022, we had a big science paper, and then last year we also had the Global Tipping Points report. And for those, we've been trying to make sure that both the papers and reports themselves, but also the graphics that developed all those, and the media messaging around them is as clear as possible, because climate tipping points are quite difficult to understand. So trying to make it as easy as possible to get the key messages across. And I think my experience of what the key misunderstandings that tend to happen are is that they can be clustered into the assumption that we know when these tipping points are going to happen, that we know that quite well, that they'd happen relatively quickly, so they'd be quite abrupt things, and that they rapidly lock in lots of more warming, so there'd be kind of a runaway warming type effect. But in reality, their thresholds, even with all the good science we've been doing recently, their thresholds remain uncertain, and we don't quite know when they're going to happen, even now. Some of them could take decades or centuries, and most of them, they do pretty much all lock in very serious impacts, but they don't necessarily lock in this kind of huge amount of extra warming, or they may cascade, but they may not. We don't know for certain. And these are difficult nuances to try and get across in the media. They're quite difficult messages to simplify down to and get that nuance through. But I think it's really important that we have to try, because otherwise it does start playing into this. It can head towards a fatalistic interpretation of these messages. And I do think that there are some actors out there who do try and instrumentalize these misunderstandings for effect by implying that climate tipping points are more certain or dramatic or immediately disastrous in order to try and shock people, or to try and support some particular measures like emergency geoengineering. And also it helps to make more click-worthy news stories as well. So there are some people who are leaning on these sort of misunderstandings for that effect, and I think it's important not to. This also gets into the difficulty of assessing and communicating what I would call low certainty or low certainty, high impact possibilities. Sometimes people talk about low likelihood, high impact, but for some of these things, we know that they probably are likely at some point. We just don't know when. So it's low certainty. And this makes low certainty situations are quite difficult and uncomfortable, especially when they potentially have quite serious ramifications. There's a tendency to want to collapse that high uncertainty into something a bit more definite. And I think it's part of why people do want to have kind of, well, when they're presented with this highly uncertain and scary sounding stuff, there's a temptation there to collapse that into, it's definitely going to happen, it's definitely doom, because it's a more comfortable message than sitting with that uncertainty. But it's also true that a lot of traditional assessments and messaging tend to skirt around the uncertain stuff to focus on what's more likely. So we definitely try and engage with this stuff, but we need to do so carefully in order to avoid going into that sort of fatalistic direction. Yeah, and I think it's also important that these hyperbolic scenarios are neither necessarily useful or honest in order to be able to invoke this sort of action we need. We know enough from climate science already for urgent action. We don't need to hyperbolize this sort of stuff in order to make the case more urgent. We know that exaggerations kind of undermine our credibility and cause collateral psychological damage, like I mentioned earlier. And some of these framings risk being co-opted as well. For example, the emergency geoengineering thing, or some of the regressive forces that are rising in the world at the moment could misuse some of these framings if we're not careful around it. And I think it can be tempting to feel that the insufficient action we have seen action, but there's insufficient action. But that's not just because people haven't been provided with enough facts, or enough of the scariest facts in particular, or that we haven't packaged them in the right way. I would agree with some of the other speakers here that the information we get from climate science is a necessary but not sufficient condition for action. We also need things like stories that tap into people's emotions as well, and visions of a different and better future in order to provide that sort of motivation, which is something that science alone cannot provide. So my approach with my science communication around tipping points, particularly with climatetippingpoints.info, was to help provide the information that we have from science in a clearly explained way. So that's a resource for educators, activists, and others to be able to consult. And then armed with that, they can tell their own stories underpinned by a robust understanding of what the science does and doesn't say, and be able to see what the limitations of the science is as well. And I see this as kind of as complementary to some of the more traditional media and communications that we normally do as scientists. I see this as a form of kind of non-linear communication, where we're kind of inviting dialogue with people and empowering people to understand the science and build on it themselves, beyond just sort of broadcasting some of these messages in a refined way. So to finish up, my take-home messages, particularly to some of the scientists here who might be thinking about how to go about comms, is that we do need to try and simplify our messages and think and make analogies and simple graphics to try and get this sort of thing across. But we need to think really carefully about how those simplifications may be understood by different audiences. You have to put yourself in other people, different audiences' shoes, assume that it probably will be misinterpreted, either mostly accidentally, but sometimes intentionally. Think about how it will be misinterpreted in order to try and think of a way of minimizing that. We have to be clear that things are uncertain around tipping points, but that's actually a reason for action rather than for inaction. That we don't know exactly what the situation is means that we need to act with precaution. We know that tipping points may happen slowly, but the responsibility for stopping them is now. So that's a way of countering that sort of idea. In fact, even if one tipping point does tip, every fraction of warming avoided now lowers the chance of tipping any more. So that's to counter that sort of fatalistic feeling. And finally, I'd say that if you're able and willing as a science communicator, engage in dialogue and help build open knowledge, as well as the more sort of traditional writing papers and trying to get media coverage. Because I think that more non-linear model is a really good complement to traditional science communication. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Really, really, really brilliant overview of some of those challenges and misinterpretations that maybe also we see manifesting once material is out there, when we have one-way dialogue rather than actually being able to engage with stakeholders and kind of co-create understanding, or even, not capacity building to a degree, but making sure it's not a broadcast that then you just drop off and people can't come back to really work with the material. I would like to bring in our colleague Albert Nordstrom as well. Albert is the Science Director of the Earth Commission, who works closely also with David. And he's a social-ecological scientist with also a background in coral reef research around tipping points, but he's also an associate professor at Stockholm Resilience Centre. Used to also be working with Future Earth as the executive director of the programme on ecosystem change and society. Albert, you have also done a lot of communications work. Currently, you're in dialogue with a range of newspapers who are working on a series around tipping points. Would love to hear some of your reflections, and also tying up with Dave's points about this. I don't want to say it's a trade-off, but the challenge of the simplification to help engage people to grasp the story, but also how the nuances can sometimes be, misinterpreted. So what have you seen when talking to journalists about, what are some of the questions that they want you to be able to answer, but it's actually really hard? Over to you, Albert.
Thanks, Maya. And yeah, quite a bit of what I was going to say is sort of an overlap with David. So I'll try and build on some of the additional points that I've been spinning around in my mind as I've been working in this space. But I can just begin by just giving a shout out to the fantastic talks by all the panelists so far, but especially Anab and Johanna. I think this point, if we're talking about social tipping points or transformations going to the future, the role of visions and providing them, and strong visions are such a critical point. I mean, there's a massive body of science which is just growing, showing how critical just the visioning process is in order to trigger transitions or transformations. And I saw some mentions in the chat. I think Valerio Lembos pointed out that's one possible stumbling block is, as a researcher interested in this, is resources, but there's definitely ways of going around that, Valerio. There's a lot of scientists working with artists with these kind of visioning processes in order to kind of plug in the science of transformation into futurism and designing concrete visions of the future. And just as a unabashed plug for some of the work the Earth Commission will be doing in the future, we're now coming up into our second phase, and one of the work streams is all around understanding transformation pathways, which will build quite substantially on visions and narratives. So keep your eyes peeled in this space. Now, going back to the issue of communicating tipping points, like you mentioned, a lot of my work in that domain, at least in the initial parts of my career, have been around local or regional tipping points, if you will, understanding regime shifts, working with coral reefs and understanding the dynamics of regime shifts. And of course, now quite unfortunately, I would say, find a lot of journalistic interest in understanding, will coral reefs disappear basically at 2 degrees? What happens? And I think that's a question that comes up quite often by journalists. Recently, you mentioned that series on tipping points, which one of the big Swedish major newspapers is going to be running. That's a question that comes up in the forefront. Will this iconic ecosystem disappear at a specific degree overnight, like a doomsday clock ticking down? And of course, the answer is no, just like David mentioned, there's uncertainty in where we understand a threshold to be, a threshold that can trigger a triggering point. And of course, any response will be staggered when it comes to ecosystems like coral reefs. Of course, the majority might start showing massive degradation at a specific threshold, but then others, because of local context, won't. But I think the key thing is, does that make the situation better? No, I mean, even if you have an aggregate situation where the broad functions and benefits of a specific ecosystem disappear, that's just as serious as all of them getting magically wiped out of the face of the earth. But it does provide some kind of strength in knowing that there is, of course, some resilience in the system. But my message to journalists then is like, even if there's not 100% certainty at when things collapse and when tipping points get triggered, we don't want to end up in a situation of having ecosystems like the northern white rhino situation, just a few select places around the world where you have coral reefs. That's not a nice future. And I think when it comes to the issue of time, I think, communicating the temporal scale of this is a challenge, because in many people's ears, 100 years, for example, which could be a possible response time for some of these bigger tipping points. It sounds like a long time, but I usually just bring it down to a communication of human generations. 100 years might sound like a long time, but actually it's just 3 to 4 human generations, which for many people just makes it much more concrete of thinking, well, that's my children and grandchildren, basically, that will be seeing the consequence of this. So it might sound like a long time, but it isn't. And then just 2 points I'd like to raise before I end up, which are quite useful when communicating tipping points, at least from a kind of natural science perspective, is that, they're not some fatalistic or scaremongering concept that have just magically just now been floated around by climate scientists. Actually, the roots and the scientific understanding of tipping points actually stretches back almost half a century, mathematics and natural science, and now increasingly in social sciences as well. For example, the work on ecological regime shift, it's massive, and it's got a very long body of work, of observations, of models, of experiments, of strong understanding of feedback processes. The colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center, for example, have this massive database of regime shifts, the regime shift database, that mapped out over 30 different types of regime shifts across the whole planet, happening at local and regional scales, mapping down their consequences. So the science behind thresholds, feedbacks, and tipping points is very robust. And when speaking with journalists, just making that point that it's, this is nothing new that's been, a buzzword that's popping up over the past 5 years. Actually, there's a very strong scientific body that gives us quite a lot of confidence in then scaling that knowledge up to try and understand the big tipping points on a planetary scale. And of course, it becomes much more difficult as you move up. And I think it was Johanna that mentioned then the need of really fostering systemic systems thinking capacities is really important, because it's sort of a cognitive problem for many humans to understand how the earth in itself can be a big system that can be impacted by human activities, but of course it can. And there we're getting increasing evidence as well. Life on Earth has repeatedly displayed these abrupt and massive changes in the past due to other drivers. So there's no reason to expect that humans can't be a driver to trigger these planetary scale regime shifts in the future. So that's one way, just bringing in the science and the sort of the kind of the comfort that there is science behind the notion of tipping points often makes communication easier. But on a more positive note, I often also just go back to that the notion of tipping points has also very successfully been used in managing our biosphere. Of course, not on a planetary scale, but on local and regional scales. Tipping point science is used all the way from managing water quality to ecosystem-based management. And it's sort of that aspect it falls under the radar. And so, it's completely possible to plug in the notion of tipping points into hopefully bigger scale management of the biosphere of the planet. I mean, for example, one classic example is in Florida Bay, big rapid ecosystem degradation of the corals of the seagrass beds there were happening in the 80s. And then basically, the approaches to restore and maintain these ecosystems, sorry, Maya, one more minute, is, specific management processes that are based on tipping point science. And they've been hugely successful. They've ensured that, the ecosystems around Florida Bay have improved. Seagrasses are thriving, they're coming back. Coral reefs, slightly less so, but also showing some signs. So again, for me, it's a bit of a hopeful message that, plugging in tipping points into decision-making has been done, and on local and regional scale. So why not on bigger scales to kind of avoid the big climate tipping points we're talking about?
Thank you so much, Albert. Enormous amount to digest there, and brilliant segue to Tim Kelly. Tim is the executive director of Earth HQ, which is the media arm of the Global Commons Alliance, of which also the Earth Commission is part of. And Earth HQ is kind of an unprecedented partnership that is also working on scaling science action base to protect people and planet, with a big kind of media collaboration that you're currently working on at the moment. Tim has also been working both with tipping point science, visualizations, documentary films, and media and web engagement for many, many, many years, and works to cultivate sort of planetary awareness through science and art. So I'm really happy to bring this sort of discussion full circle. Tim, if you could tell us a little bit about your experiences, and then also, tease on this point about the uncertainty. And there's a question that I would like the whole panel to think about when we come to the debate in a moment, but about this balance of this need for action, insufficient kind of action that we're seeing, and how we're going to engage people through storytelling and through emotive work that, to a degree, the exact science and that uncertainty can sometimes prove that it's a challenge to bring both of those two pieces together, emotive, co-created storytelling and exact technical science that is also, being very, very clear about nuances. That's something I would love us to all discuss. Before that, Tim, please come in and share with us your reflections.
Thank you, Maya. And it's a great panel, really impressive group. So I've been in the business of storytelling, first with National Geographic, running all their media for 30 years. And like Colin, storytelling with a mission of inspiring people to care about the planet. We have a long ways to go to succeed in that. But I think this evolving tipping point science is really important and useful. But it's tough, it's like you get that fortune cookie at the end of dinner, and you crack it open and you read your fortune, and it says you're screwed in 16 different ways. So it's a little bit scary, but I think fear has a very useful place. We need to be afraid of what we're doing to the planet, and we need to know that it's going to lead us to some disastrous consequences. I think some of the challenges with tipping point science is that it is often focused on, the immediate impact in the Arctic, the Antarctic, the Amazon, coral reefs, and these things often seem remote to many people. So we have to bring home the fact that they will have far-reaching impacts on everybody, no matter where they are. We need to we need to make that crystal clear. And I think that's one of the challenges in how we talk about tipping points. Also, they're a projection of something that happens in the future. We need to connect the dots from the road we're on now to where that leads, and the fact that there are pathways of action to change that path. So I think giving people pathways of action is a critical challenge that we have to pay more attention to, because there has been a lot more attention paid to the negative, disastrous tipping points than painting than describing the positive tipping points that are possible. And I think that can be accomplished. And I think, journalism, education, and art, largely speaking, are the ways that we can impact and change culture. And it's a really fundamental change in culture that we need to bring about. When you think about the modern world we live in, I think that the fact that individuals' data is being tracked something like 700 times a day in many parts of the world, and we're being inundated and marketed to in a gigantic way through social media. There is a blizzard of information, and I think it's very hard for people to really focus other than being faintly aware and anxious. And the research shows from Yale and others that most people are very concerned about climate and the associated impacts on nature and so forth, but they're not. It's not a priority for them to take action, and it's not, and they don't understand how they can take action, or if they do take action, that it would even matter in the great scheme of things. And I think that's a huge challenge that Colin was alluding to, and Anab was alluding to in the work she's doing. How do we help people envision a better future and a pathway to take action, and how they can personally get involved? And I think that's an issue we think about a lot, but because the public is largely left to fend for themselves. They don't have access to a lot of vital information, journalism, and science. Most of it is behind paywalls. They rely on a tidal wave of misinformation and disinformation through social media to figure out what's going on. And so that's one reason why we're organizing a large collaborative of media, tech, and the advertising community to form a bridge between the science community and the creative community to be able to accomplish storytelling at a scale that hasn't been done, to try to provide a public service media ecosystem that will enable what's missing right now, which is political will, public engagement, to be able to make the major transitions that we need to be able to make. It's not enough that decision makers, policymakers, and government officials are reached without the public being involved. We're seeing the big blocker right now to action. There just isn't enough political will, and so we've created this. It's really an idea, the Earth Public Information Collaborative, EPIC. We're launching the first Leadership Council meeting of the group next week, and it draws from people from all over these industries, from advertising, marketing, media, tech, and science and grassroots, to build this new community. We're also working with Johanna and the PIC team and the Planetary Guardians team, Virgin United, Global Commons Alliance, on launching a planetary boundary health check site in September, which will track the science of planetary boundaries. It will track the the latest science on tipping points. It'll connect the dots between extreme events and the longer term risks. And it will also provide a whole series of pathways to action, which I think is where we need to spend a lot of time and focus, trying to give people that vision of the future and pathways to act rather than just being consumed with anxiety. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, but thank you for having me and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Tim, and to all of the speakers on, this is not a small topic. So it's appreciated that you've taken out the time and put such thought into this. We've got some great questions in the chat. Before we go to some of those, I just wanted to ask you all I've tied together a few of the points from all of your different talks. And I think one thing I'm really interested in, and I know other colleagues are both in communications, is this need for action. Colin, as you said, this is one of the biggest transformations that we need to mobilize the entire planet around. And when I say we, I mean everybody needs to mobilize where they can in their communities. How to do that within this complex system of also how material and information is shared and condensed, but that the science isn't kind of hijacked and interpreted in a different way, whilst still enabling it to be brought to life in a way that is co-created. And as you were saying, Anab, very much about looking at this different type of approach whereby communications doesn't come at the end of a project when you've got money to spend. It's integrated at the very beginning when science is being produced, so that you can hold hands through that process and work out ways forward. So I just want to give that framing to the whole group of you, and anyone who wants to jump in with a reflection, please do.
I could just quickly talk to some research we've been doing at King's College. And one of the experts we spoke to is Chris DeMare, who's worked a lot with ecological anxiety and is a neuroscientist. And he talks about the idea of seeding imagination and, simple things like, for instance, if you are used to working from home and going to your food cupboard every 2 hours to eat that cookie that is in that cupboard, and you just can't kind of stop yourself from doing it because it's there. But you'll find that when you go and work from somewhere else, you just won't have that craving for that cookie because you're not there. And so I think there's something really powerful in that about how, when we are not there, when we cannot see this as our lived experience or in some way relate to this idea of this thing, we cannot imagine things in abstract. We need to be able to seed people's imagination and therefore create the conditions and the environments that enable them to think differently in that. So if we are sitting in this room and telling people, oh, tipping points are coming, as so many of you have said, it is so abstract. And there is so much science that talks to the fact that we actually use only 2% of our brains to think through data and numbers and abstraction. And yet we continue to use those same tools for 98% of our communication, whilst actually stories, metaphors, and experiences are what drive people's emotions and therefore decisions. And I just believe that there is a way in which we have to acknowledge that the data is always what has been, not what could be. And that what could be is the space for creating speculative data. And that can be done in many different forms. So it's really about how we work together to collaborate on creating action.
That's fantastic. I would love to invite one of our scientists to reflect on Anab's points. Albert, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, just building off what's been said, but maybe a slightly different tangent. I think from a scientific perspective, what is critical, I think, to help guide science communication and media when they report on climate tipping points is to get some increased evidence of how risk perception changes with an exposure to tipping points. From what science is telling us, that there's basically 3 ways an exposure to tipping points can change your risk perception. It can increase concern. It can lead to fatalism. There's also evidence that it actually has no effect. People don't change their risk perception. So I think pushing the boundaries of social science, looking at those 3 different hypotheses and guiding us as to how risk perceptions actually do change. And these things might be different in different contexts and geographies and demographics, right? And then, yeah, the point we will be repeating, the importance of co-producing and co-creating visions is there, and how you actually do that. We've heard some fantastic examples so far. I can add a few more. You could really, and this is just going back to some previous work, regional tipping points. I think some of the most successful ways of how regional tipping point science, for example, in specific ecosystems, has led to good effect is when you've actually worked with local managers to understand the tipping point dynamics in very kind of collaborative manners. So one can imagine you could do that, more frequently, more expansively, more emotional use of visual and story-based information that's helping to convey the meaning and potential implications of the concepts of tipping points. You could explore that through in-depth interviews or focus groups that can help you gain a deeper perspective into the different learning mechanisms and barriers and challenges associated with climate tipping points, as opposed to just climate change more generally. And then, involving fun activities with stakeholders and decision makers, role playing, active learning strategies, storytelling's been mentioned, but games, things that are visceral in a sense, I think have been shown in some promising experiments as ways that can increase understanding around tipping points. So yeah, just a few suggestions of how one could possibly go forward in this very complicated space.
Thanks, Albert. Johanna, please.
Just to jump on those really wonderful and powerful points, I think an aspect is really about forming partnerships between institutions over time. Scientific work, difficult, often underfunded. Same goes for city governments. But there are ways, if you're working at a university, for example, or if you're working for a particular city, to start to form partnerships in place and start to understand how, if we're talking about direct actions, city levels, different regional scale governments are places in which oftentimes action is either forming or can occur. So really emphasizing that there are ways when relationships are built over time to start to say, okay, I'm doing my research. I am very stressed and, limited on time, but I know that there's a person that I can call and say, hey, this is an option for if we're talking about an intervention that could be made, that could maybe link up to what people are discussing in this present moment. Additionally, I'm doing some work with a few different museums, and I think that there's a lot of curiosity and interest for certain institutions who are, again, known as being visual art museums. Some of them are also, natural history museums that are starting to ask, what is our role in the future? Because museums are changing, like so many of our institutions are. The Planetarium in the San Francisco Bay Area is one example. There's another museum that is being built right now. DC in the United States, the Museum of Tomorrow. These places are very much focused on both representing aspects of scientific work, but then also translating different initiatives for communication to the wider public that also invite conversations about different actions. So again, the value of partnerships and then institutional longevity of those partnerships, I think, is a really powerful place for people to start to explore and invest more in.
Maya, I just want to echo something too that Albert said about game-based design. I think that is an amazing opportunity to do things there, and we're working now with the game development company and Climate Interactive, the maker of the Inroads. MIT developed Climate Simulator, and our Schrock Foundation to develop a new sort of planetary stewardship simulator game that we're hoping to put out in the next 12 months or so. It's a big opportunity. I think the challenge with all of this storytelling stuff is to do good visual storytelling is expensive. And right now, many of the traditional avenues of storytelling are kind of broken. Looking at the field of journalism, for instance, you're seeing huge job losses throughout the industry as a few who are succeeding with paywalls, the rest in the digital space are just having a really hard time. And then in the education space, the K-12 education space in the US and many other parts of the world, not all, but many, we do a terrible job teaching about how the planet works. And this is perpetuating the problem that we have in broader society. We could, in a few generations, in a dozen years, we could turn it around if we fix K-12 education and make sure that every student who graduates has a basic understanding of the science of the planet. But we're not doing that, and that's a huge gap. Education is kind of a backwater of the climate activism area and needs more attention. So I think that's where we need to bring more resources to bear, and we need more public service support from some of the big institutions, from the corporate side, from some of the big technology, media, and advertising industries that we're trying to bring together now. That is our big challenge, I think, is bringing the resources to this battle to reach the public in a more thorough and effective way.
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, resourcing at the scale required is an enormous challenge, not to mention the different needs in different communities as well. You know, what works in Sweden, for example, does not work in another context, and also making sure that people across the world, across continents, are part of building the stories that are relevant for their communities. We've got 13 minutes left and an enormous amount to get through. So I would first I'm going to take a question from the most popular question from the audience is if you could all share some of your favorite examples of great storytelling on climate tipping points or positive social tipping points, anything that you've come across. I will recommend if you could put those into the chat, and then we can move to discuss some of the other questions that are here. The second most popular one is, what do you think works when engaging and influencing policymakers in this space? I mean, this is a riddle, I think, that we're always all trying to work with. You know, it's case specific, it's group specific, it is you know, COP or meeting or work stream specific. But from all of your perspectives, and maybe I'd like to bring Colin in and also David to give some reflections. First, what have you seen working within a policy-making audience?
Yeah, thanks, Maya. Yeah, totally take your point that it's very, very context specific, so there's no one general answer. But I think the things that we've seen work the most effective is when you do two things simultaneously. You bring communications to a policy audience that targets them as humans, not just policymakers. We've done it with yourselves, obviously, at Davos. We've done it in a number of different scenarios. Most probably recently, or most effectively, was when we produced the opening ceremony at COP26 in Glasgow. We took David Attenborough there, and instead everybody else did speeches, some incredible speeches, actually, particularly from speakers from the Global South. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister was less impressive, but there were some great speeches. But deliberately, we wanted to break it up and have a story told. So, you know, the lights changed, music came on, screens came on. You broke that scenario. People are used to seeing PowerPoints. They're used to getting speeches, even really impressive speeches, that you break it up and you talk to people like people. But the second part of it, and I think you've got to do both at the same time, is the belief of those policymakers that people outside, whether that's stakeholders who vote for them or businesses that might support or oppose them, are also bought into this trajectory, and that the story you're telling or the communications that you're trying to deliver, they plausibly believe you will impact outside of that moment as well. So I think we've certainly found actually the most effective point of influence is probably, let's say, 6 months before a big project we're doing gets released. So let's say we're doing a big project on, or we are at the moment, on the ocean and climate change. Actually, our point of influence is now showing its policymakers, which we're doing, and saying 6 months from now, 12 months from now, this is going to be a mass public moment. Which side of this debate do you want to be on? Because you're going to have an opportunity, and creating that opportunity for the people that fundamentally want to change to rise to the surface and do something, and opening up that space for them. And those that perhaps would resist it to feel that their position might be under threat if they were not to take a more progressive position. So I think it's how you bring the outside in, and then how you speak to those policymakers as humans as well as policymakers.
Thanks, fully support that. Yeah, we're all humans, even in our professional capacity, and our brains respond to emotional-based information as well as intellectual-based information. David, please share some of your reflections on policy, speaking to policymakers and how they engage with this kind of science.
Yeah, so interestingly, I've not actually engaged very much directly with policymakers through the last few years, despite you might have expected it on the basis of having had some quite big papers and reports that were being trying to communicate, but I've not directly talked to them very much. But I would probably echo what Colin would say there, that in general, if you come and do a specific policy briefing full of scientific details and facts and graphs and things like that, that's going to land in one part of politicians' brain. And that's probably going to land in a part of politicians' brain where partly they just don't understand it because they don't have that background. We've had discussions recently in the UK that there are many politicians here who do not understand how to read a graph. And so that won't necessarily work very well. But it's also going to land in a part of their brain where it's going to be more, it's another issue silo, that they're trying to do something about climate change because they need to do enough in that area in order to defend themselves and particular demographics for a certain number of votes. So you're just another issue, special sector interest of trying to get some level of policy being targeted. Whereas if you connect more on that emotional level, you're landing in a different area. You're landing somewhere it's actually of a concern to them as a person, and that's more likely to cut through. So in general, in my SciComm stuff, I've not really differentiated between different types of readers. I've been addressing everyone together. So it's members of the public, whether they're just readers who are interested, or they're activists who are concerned, or they're politicians or business people who are reading to get a better view in it. I think everyone needs to have that sort of relatively open, simple, explained resource to be able to go into and figure out what the science does and doesn't say. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, David. Anab.
I just wanted to say that we do engage quite a lot with policymakers. And I think the one thing that I've learned is, and they've been really open and receptive to different forms of engagement for consultations, big consultations, or whether smaller groups, and around the use of storytelling. And one big learning we got is that when they are exploring new policies, they're not always hoping that the policy recommendations will be taken on board, but they are actually working towards shaping public understanding. So a big part of the policy making work is the shaping of public understanding, and that's where these tools of storytelling can really be very, very powerful. And the other is more of a question, because what I've also found is that of course, we rely on evidence-based policy-making decisions are based on evidence. So my question is, if that's been the primary modus operandi of how decisions have been made, then why are we in the place we are today? So there's something not happening right? We have all the evidence, we have the scientific data that shows that certain policy decisions should have been made. And yet, of course, they haven't been made, which is why we are talking about the disastrous situation of the tipping points. So there's something going terribly wrong with the tools and instruments we've currently used in the last 100 years to make decisions about our collective futures. And we really, really need to recognize that new tools need to be brought to the table if we are to move towards a different world.
Thank you, Anab. And yeah, I think everybody can sympathize and empathize with the fact that action is not fast enough. Things are happening, obviously, but we're also existing within a system that we know that we also need to change. And I think you're absolutely right that, you know, decision makers are not acting at the speed and scale required. What are those blockages? They can be many. They can also be, you know, vested interests in trying to slow down this process as much as possible. And at the same time, you know, how can we, whilst trying to unpack and bring forward a transformation, bring forward new tools to meet those challenges, whilst being cognizant that there are strong forces working against these pieces. Johanna, please.
Very much agree with what you just said, Anab. And in the work that I also do with policymakers, a lot of the kind of framing of a lot of projects is who are we trying to reach? So some of them, Anab, I completely agree with you. It's about changing kind of wider scales of public perception. Other projects have been about shifting institutional ideas within the particular scale of government or policymakers that I'm working with, whether it's at a site-specific kind of community scale, a city scale, a regional scale, or in the United States at a state scale. So I think really attuning to audience, which is such a storytelling and, you know, design intervention question, is essential. And it's obviously not something that people who are trained scientists, especially in the hard sciences, are necessarily focused on, but I think it's an essential piece of the puzzle. And if there's not enough, again, funding or time to attune to who is the audience here in order to translate that to wider audiences, that's where these partnerships that need to be cultivated over time can really come in, not just handy, but necessary. Who are we speaking to, and what kind of trajectories of time might they need in order to shift their thinking? Because with certain audiences, they're open. You're speaking kind of to the choir already, but with other audiences, especially with institutional systems that are really intractable in terms of changing habits, cultural outlooks, attitudes towards change, it's going to have to be a slightly longer process. So again, attuning to audience and then catering messages accordingly and having different kind of linked aspects of how much more involved scientific information should be, because with certain policymakers, they don't have any time. So in terms of really making it a short piece, essential, but having access to the increased, more detailed layers available so that those people who do have more interest and more time still have that readily available, pretty essential. One example that I think a lot of people have been talking about, both in the chat and I think also in the wider world, is Ken Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, right? He's talking so much about governmental systems. He obviously does a lot of research at the same time. I think what's been really powerful about seeing how people translate his work into the real world is that they're able to look at a lot of the sources that he cited. He's shared a lot of those with the wider world, but he's giving it in an ingredient, a package that is emotionally connected. So we know that people are open to these messages. We just have to put them in packages that speak to people at particular scales that we are trying to work with, and then make the additional aspects of the research that was involved in translating those messages available.
Fantastic summation, Johanna, thank you. We've got 2 minutes. I want to give everybody 30 seconds for a last point that you would like to make sure all the participants leave with today. And I will start with Tim.
Well, I think, as somebody said, this can only be done through large alliances and collaboration. I think getting across the science of tipping points is a challenge for anybody, but I think also reaching the right people in the right form, the right messaging, the right voices. So it really requires a large alliance of partners working together. And so look forward to working with all of the people on this panel.
Thank you.
Coming year.
Caro.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we as scientists can take away that there's a lot of people who know exactly what they're doing and that we can learn from them, like Zimm, Colin, Johanna, and Anab, and that we should be more cognizant of the expertise that is out there in the communications field, so that we can become more engaging when we work with messaging. Yeah, thanks for all these great examples.
Thank you, Caro. Colin.
Thank you. So first of all, just to agree that there's the connection between science and communications has never been more vital. I think we've all underpinned this. The second sort of plea I put out there and challenge that I think we're going to need to overcome is most of humans connect with other human stories. That's the thing we all connect with. And most of the most incredible stories of solutions towards whether it's deploying the positive tipping points or counteracting the negative tipping points are no longer recorded or shared. And that's partially to do with the fall in journalism that Tim talked about, but also the lack of systematic approach across lots of organizations to recording and sharing these incredible stories. And love to work with as many people as possible to change that going forward.
Thank you so much, Colin. Anab, and then we'll go to Johanna, Albert, and then we will say goodbye.
Thank you. I'm echoing everyone's sentiments here. I had a quote from Christina Figueres that I really like, which she says, "We tend to cling to what we know and resist what is new, even when the new brings tremendous benefits." So really, how can we focus on the new things that can bring benefits?
Echo everyone's thinking about how wonderful this panel has been. Just a quick takeaway of speculative futures, speculative design, hugely powerful. They can be expensive and take a long time to build, and they can also be very lo-fi, cheap, affordable, whether it's like writing down the trajectory that you would want to see for yourself and your own family, or in scientific practice, how would you want information to be communicated and actually have impact? That's where we start from. That's how we build towards something that is much more readily available to wider scales of people. So that sounds really simple, but it's actually, a cultivation of hope over time. And so really articulating the changes that we want to see and the work that we do and how that information is communicated across scales is how we get incentive to build these partnerships that can help us actually affect change in these transcalar ways that we need to do.
Fabulous. Thank you. Albert, I think you're our last one, so I think we've lost David. Over to you to wrap up, and then I can do a quick wrap up.
Fantastic. Well, I can just add that when we're talking about developing positive scenarios or stories about the future, it's quite often to fall into the trap of just focusing on the role of just a few common large-scale external drivers, the role of technology or environmental policy. But I think it's critical to also take into account the role of surprising bottom-up initiatives that really build up the future going forward, and things happening outside of Northern Europe and the US. The myriad of different transformative sustainability initiatives happening at the margin of our radars. They're going to play a key role in shaping the future, and we should be bringing them into this participatory visioning process, whatever it's going to look like.
Fantastic. So I'm going to say thank you everybody on the panel, and thank you everybody who've come in to watch this session, post questions. It's been brilliant. I've loved talking to all of you. I've loved working with all of you. And I think there's sort of 5 words, we've heard partnerships, a few more words here, audiences, who we are speaking to, why, where, and meeting them on their terms. Storytelling, emotive storytelling being so critical, and resources underpinning that. So fairly banal words, but absolutely fundamental to what we need to do going forward. So I encourage everybody who is either watching this recording or on the call still now, reach out to various different groups, apply for money together, get a coalition going, get bigger and more connected, and link arms. And we're all in this together. Thank you very much, everybody.